Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome into a new episode of Capitol View, a webcast brought to you by the Daily Journal and djournal.com, coming to you every Monday around 2 o'clock, talking state politics, the legislature, and everything going on down there. Of course, Bobby Harrison, our Capitol Bureau Chief, the one giving us all this insight and information. How you doing there, Bobby? Have a good Thanksgiving?
I did. I had a great Thanksgiving, Brad. Not all my football teams won, but that's part of it, I guess.
Well, as long as you ate good food, that's the most important thing, in my
I did.
opinion.
My wife did a good job.
Well, good. I ate well also, and I still got a bunch of leftover sweet potato casserole in the fridge, like 2 bowls of it. So I'm trying my best to put it all away, before it all goes bad, because nobody else in my house is going to eat it. My wife makes it just for me, basically. So I gotta find some help. I recruit somebody to help me all that. Yeah. Good problem to have, Bobby.
Let's post it. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's all right, Bobby. Let's talk about more pressing matters, I suppose. Let's talk about this EdBuild contract. First of all, there was a lot of clamoring and criticism after state leaders declined to make the contract public, and finally they did so last week. And it turns out, I believe Jim Hood, the Attorney General, said you kind of have to. I mean, because it's the law, basically, isn't it, Bobby?
Yeah, well, they've not listened. It would not be the first time where they didn't listen to Jim Hood's legal opinion, but this time, at least, I guess he helped spur the decision to make it public. When I say they, of course, we're talking about House Speaker Philip Gunn and Lieutenant Governor Tate Reeves and their leadership team that opted not to make the contract public. But I mean, it was not only Hood, though. I mean, you had the governor, Republican Governor Phil Bryant, a key ally of Reeves and Hood. I mean, Reeves and Gunn. While he didn't criticize them per se, he said that's their decision whether to make it public. But he said, I believe that if it's state taxpayer dollars that the EdBuild contract was, that it should be made public. So they were kind of catching it from all sides, and in the end, they decided they'd made a bad decision.
And then when they made it public, and you can go see it for yourself at transparency.mississippi.gov. Pretty easy to find it. Click on the contracts tab and go from there. Everybody's looked at it, and no smoking guns, Bobby. Nothing special there, which makes you wonder, why were they being so secretive about it? What was the big deal? But also, Jay Hughes, Democrat from Oxford, he's like, well, the fact that there's really no details is actually kind of concerning. I mean, no smoking guns, but not a lot of detail either.
Yeah, that was his. I mean, of course, just a little background. EdBuild, of course, has been contracted for essentially $125,000 to help the legislature rewrite the school funding formula to provide state money to the local school districts, and it was kind of done out of the blue and without much notice when they were contracted with this New Jersey-based company, EdBuild. And so they were there to look at the contract, and the legislative leadership said, well, we have a public records law, but the public records law doesn't apply to the legislature, so we're not going to let you see it. And so when they finally reversed course and did release the contract, Jay Hughes read it, and he's an attorney and deals with contracts every day, and he said the lack of specificity in the contract causes him concern that there are some agreements made that were not in the contract, he has concern about that. And of course, the concern that some people have is that the legislature hasn't funded the current school funding formula, so there's just an effort to send less money to local school districts or to send money to private schools to the public schools. And so there's all sorts of concerns about what's going to actually happen with this rewrite. And by them not releasing the contract, or at least for so long, it just kind of builds on that suspicion.
Yeah, I think their contract runs through June 30th, basically the end of the fiscal year. And, they've been trying to get it to where they can go forward with this with the next session that starts in January, and you're in a bit of a time crunch there. But if this contract runs out in June, it seems like they pretty much have to get something done this session, don't they?
Yeah, well, that's their goal, to get something done this session. Of course, the contract, you probably have it there in front of you. They announced this in October, and the contract didn't begin in October, so they don't have much time, to get any recommendations together by the time the legislature convenes in January. They've had EdBuild officials had one meeting with a joint House and Senate education committees, and then they had one public hearing in Jackson to let the public have input, and that meeting was announced, I think, 2 or 3 days before the meeting was held. It was held at 4 o'clock here in Jackson on a weekday, and they said it was only going to last an hour. They actually they showed some good gracious and let it grace a little will let the meeting go for 15-20 minutes longer, but there were still people in line to speak who didn't get an opportunity to speak, and there's people that are clamoring for more public meetings in other parts of the state, like in Tupelo and on the coast, but it doesn't appear that's going to happen. So they're going to go into this rewrite with a lot of people being suspicious and building up some ill will at the same time. So we'll just have to see where it goes during the legislative session.
Yeah, I guess the timing of it makes it it can at least give the perception that they're just trying to shove something through with a minimal amount of input from other people.
Right. That's what some people are saying. They're saying that the current school funding formula was worked on for multiple years, 2 or 3 years, had a lot of different groups working on it, and it doesn't appear that that's happening with this particular rewrite or potential rewrite. I mean, we should add that. Until the legislature actually approves something, the governor signs it. It's not a given that there's going to be a rewrite, but with the Republicans holding majorities in both chambers and the governor's office and the Republican leadership of the legislature pushing this, there's a good chance it's going to happen.
One bit of language in the contract states that any confidential information EdBuild may come across during its work, they have to keep private. They're talking about funding of public education. What kind of confidential information could they come across here?
Yeah, Brad, that stuck out to me. I put that in my story. I hadn't seen much other reporting on it, and I'm going to try to do some more reporting on it, but it was tough to do that last week during Thanksgiving. But it just seems unusual to me. I mean, you're dealing with public schools, public finances. I'm not sure what type of information will need to be kept confidential. They shouldn't be dealing with like student records or anything, or at least individual students' records. So it just that was just bizarre. Maybe it's just boilerplate language. I don't know, but it just seemed bizarre to me for that to be in the contract.
All right. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about state tax revenue collections here, Bobby. And apparently you had a story just yesterday, I believe it was, about that. And back in April they had an estimate, and now they're kind of saying, well, maybe it won't even be that much. Kind of explain a little bit what's going on there.
Well, it gets real complicated.
Yeah, it does.
In April, they set the estimate for when they did the budget. You had to know how much money you're going to collect before you can put together a budget to know how much money you can spend. And they did that in April at the end of the legislative session, right before they passed the budget. And then a few weeks ago, they revised that estimate upward, which is kind of was strange because revenue hadn't been meeting the estimate through the first 4 months of the current budget year. Budget year begins on July 1st, and I'm not sure how much is the revenue is below the estimate, but it's definitely below the estimate, which means that's not good for the state balancing its budget. But so in a couple of weeks ago, legislative leadership increased the estimate, and so I thought that was strange. So I started looking at the numbers, and actually, if you look at the numbers, they still think that they lowered the estimate in terms of the amount of just general tax revenue they expect to take in from income tax, sales tax, and that type of thing. What they did, they raised the estimate. You remember this at the end of the session, they passed a law that took special funds. There were like fees on traffic tickets and assessments and those types of things that were levied for particular purposes. And instead of levying those for those purposes, they send that money to the general fund. So they actually are raising the estimate because they're taking that money now. And so that means they're having more money. But still, if you just look at the general economic condition of the state, revenue is still not coming in at the pace that is needed, or that would have been needed to fund the budget without without raiding those special funds, if you will.
Well, Bobby, I'm no good at math, and you did a good job explaining all that and in your story as well. But it still leaves me with my head spinning a little bit. Long story short,
Well,
though, long story short, state revenue is not is still something that's going to be a struggle. Darren Webb, the state economist, doesn't see any significant growth coming, does he?
no, and the key thing to remember is that, I mean, it's going to be a tough budget year for the legislature to fund all the state agencies at the level to provide the current services, because the sales tax, income tax, which are the two primary sources of state revenue, they're underperforming right now, and so that's going to be an issue when the legislative session begins in January.
And I was mentioning Darren Webb talking just about the Mississippi economy overall. He says he expects the state's economic growth, reading from your story here, Bobby, says it's still going to be behind that of the nation as a whole, projects it to grow by about 1.7% in 2017, and I think 2% in 2018. So, and a lot of things could change that, obviously, Bobby. It's not a very positive outlook. I mean, is this still just a residue from the Great Recession? We're still trying to get back from that, or does that kind of depend on who you talk to about what's causing it?
Well, a couple of things. Our revenue has always grown slowly, if not for outside influences. Like in the '90s, we had real good revenue growth because we created a casino industry that there was from nothing to a pretty successful casino gaming industry in a matter of a few years. And during that period, we saw double-digit income revenue growth. And then after Katrina in 2002 coast, and all the insurance money coming in, we saw significant revenue growth. But outside of scenarios like that, our revenue in Mississippi our growth has always been kind of slow and steady at best, and so maybe that's just a return to the normal for Mississippi without and then on top of that, we've had several pretty sizable tax cuts that is taking money out of the revenue stream. So all those things are playing a factor in our state revenue, I think.
Yeah, Katrina was 05. What you mentioned?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned casinos, and we actually there's a story from Mississippi Today that came out today talking about the possibility of a state lottery, something that's been discussed and that we've discussed here, Bobby, and maybe there's a little more openness to that possibility from Governor Bryant and others.
Yeah, the governor said he would. I think he said a couple of times that he would consider it. A casino bill passed on lottery language passed the House twice during the 2016 session, but died in the Senate. And Tate Reeves has been the lieutenant governor has not been. He's indicated he's not a big fan of the lottery. But then I think a lot of people who at one time were opposed to the lottery are saying now, you have most of the surrounding states have a lottery. I think there's only 5 or 6 states in the nation who do not have a lottery.
Yeah.
And we have people driving to Tennessee, Arkansas, I think, has a lottery, and Louisiana, I know, has a lottery. And I know people drive to Louisiana, for instance. My neighbors, just to buy lottery tickets. That's money leaving the state that ain't coming back to the state. So I mean, and I hear people from Tupelo say, they know people that drive up to Tennessee to do the same thing.
Yep. All right. Well, one of many issues that I'm sure will arise in the new session, which is sneaking up on us a little over a month away, Bobby, and certainly you'll be on top of that and all the other stories here. That's it for Capitol View today. Thanks for joining us. Again, this is a webcast that comes to you every Monday around 2 p.m. If you miss it, just watch the replay at djournal.com whenever you please. You can follow Bobby on Twitter at BobbyHarrison9. I'm on there as well at Brad Locke. Thanks for joining us on this Monday. Bobby, good stuff as always.
Appreciate it, Brad.
All right. That's it for this Monday. We will see y'all next week. Have a good one.